Hey, my name is Jordan Loftus. This is the first low budget episode of Bible Better, just a ministry dedicated to helping us all understand the Bible better. Today we're going to do a short lesson from 1 Samuel 23. This is when Saul is bearing down on David. He's trying to catch him and kill him. He's really gone into these murderous rages where shortly before this text he hurled a spear at his own son, Jonathan, if you'll remember, who's besties with David. So Saul is just really transformed into this paranoid, bloodthirsty king who's doing everything he can to hold on to his throne that has been threatened by this guy named David, who's sort of rising despite his humility. People are making up songs about his heroic deeds and juxtaposing him with Saul, saying David's essentially done 10 times what Saul has accomplished, even with Saul as king. And so it's made him super jealous, even to the point where he chucked a spear at his own kid because he felt like he was in league with David, which he was. But this is the depth to which the king of Israel, Saul, has fallen, which is just incredible if you think about being in that frame of mind where you would chuck a weapon at your own kid. Like, things are not right. And remember, he was often overcome by these evil, an evil spirit, which that's a whole nother topic, but sent from the Lord, and David would come and he would soothe him, right? And so we see that Saul is really like descending into this madness and bloodthirsty rage. If you're a fan of Breaking Bad, this is kind of like Walter White is just getting further and further into it, and now these dark tendrils of evil are gripping his heart. So if we say it in dramatic fashion. So in 1 Samuel 23, we have this place where David has been running from Saul, some near misses. He's been hiding out in the rocks, but now Saul's forces are right on the other side of this mountain. So David's on one side with his little band of really not an all-star team. They're the people who were destitute, poor, bitter, sick. Like, these were basically the dregs of society that came, and David became commander of them. So that ragtag crew is running from a king and his well-equipped army. So Saul and his army is on one side. David and his band of Muppets are on the other side, and it is about to get real at this point. So I'm going to look at three things in this text here for us to consider and understand. There's so much more here, but these are three awesome takeaways, I think, that have been big for me as I've done my devotional work in here. And the first is in 1 Samuel 23, verse 14. So David, it says, "And David remained in the strongholds in the wilderness, in the hill country of the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God did not give him into his hand." So here's David sneaking around, hiding in the rocks, hiding in caves, hiding up on mountaintops, that whole kind of thing. And Saul is pursuing, like we just talked about. But it says here, but God did not give him into his hand. So the first thing to understand is that our lives belong to God. So God owns our lives in his sovereignty. And so they are his to do with what he will. This means that if it is not his will for us to be taken by an enemy, in this case, for Saul to overtake him, doesn't matter if Saul had 1,000,000 people. It doesn't matter if someone took a nuclear bomb in a time machine back then and gave it to Saul and said, "Here you go, press the big red button and nuke this dude in the mountains." It doesn't matter what happens or what forces come against us, because our hand or God's hand holds our lives, right? And it is powerful. It is the one that fights for us. It is the one that flicked and the stars sprinkled into the universe, right? So we see here that no matter what Saul was going to do, it was kind of like this, do your worst, Saul. It didn't matter, because David's life was in God's hand, and God did not give his life over to Saul. So no matter where we're at in our lives, if we fast forward, no matter where we're at in our lives, our life belongs to God. No matter the circumstances that surround us, no matter how deep or dark, no matter what kind of caves we feel like we're crawling around in and hiding from life, our lives belong to God. And we even see this in Jesus. In Psalm 53, I think it's verse 10, but in Psalm 53, it says, "For it was the will of the Lord to crush him." So it was God's will that Jesus would go to the cross and be crushed and punished for our sin. Of course, we know that it was glorious because he rose again 3 days later, but even Jesus' life belonged to the Father when he came onto this earth, and he had a very specific plan and purpose for him. So from the creator of all things who incarnated to David's life, who is the king, right, of whom Jesus was part of his legacy, now to our lives today as adopted sons and daughters who will rule and reign with Jesus. So this long lineage, we see this picture. Our lives belong to God alone. And that's a comforting thing, because if you look back in Exodus chapter 34, God describes himself for the first time in the Bible, and the first thing he tells Moses is, "I am merciful and abounding in steadfast love." So, and this ends up being the most quoted verse in the Bible by the Bible. So when God is described, this is what we see. He's merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, has this covenant relationship with his people, and he will not break it. He will not be the one to break the covenant, right? And so we are in the new covenant now, covered in the blood of Jesus, and all of this just proves our lives in God's hands is the best and safest place we could possibly be. The second thing, I want to fast forward here to verses 15, 16, and 17, and then we'll see how now we strengthen one another, how Jonathan comes to David. So David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life. Big surprise. David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh, so still in the same kind of place. And Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David at Horesh and strengthened his hand in God. And he said to him, "Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Saul my father also knows this." So remember, just the verse before, it says that God did not give David's hand to Saul. So what we find is that we strengthen one another by reminding each other of God's promise and of his words, of his words and his promise. That's what Jonathan does. Jonathan comes out to David in this awful place. He's surrounded on all sides. This is where we get a ton of the Psalms written out of this lonely, deep place of despair. Jonathan comes to him, and it says, it says here, and strengthened David's hand in God. So and we can also think of hand as kind of our personal strength and our ability, but this is how we encourage one another in these times as we come, and we don't have to have the perfect words, right? Jonathan didn't have to come and say, "Well, David, when my father was bearing down on me in the wilderness and was trying to kill me, here's what I did," right? He didn't have to come and, one, have the same exact life experience, although he had some of it, and two, he didn't have to come with this really crazy wisdom that he had manufactured, or he wasn't like a trained counselor or psychologist, right? He just came and he spoke God's words to David and reminded him of his promise. He said that, "Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you." That's what God was communicating, that I am not giving you into his hand. And then he said, "You shall be king over Israel," right? That's what Samuel had come to choose, the youngest son of Jesse. You will be king in Israel. And so we see Jonathan reminding him of God's words, and then reminding him of God's promise. And then the third thing, though, that's the most beautiful is, again, Jonathan didn't have this master plan for him to overcome the turmoil or the problem that was facing him. Instead, we see him simply saying, and I'll be with you. I'm going to be right next to you. This is, echoed in the New Testament by bearing one another's burdens, by remembering we're part of one body, right? We're knit together. We're part of the same organism, if you will, like of the church. And so this is just as true today as it was then. But he says, I'm going to be with you. I am with you. And this strengthens us when we know that just as God has a covenant with us, we have a covenant to one another. In verse 18, it says here, and the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. David remained at Horesh, and Jonathan went home. So David is strengthened. He's reminded of God's promise. He's infused with some strength by God's words. And then he's also assured that not only is God with him, but Jonathan is right there by his side. And the third thing in this story, if we cruise all the way to the end in verses 28 and 29, we see the wrap up, the end of this episode, where, again, Saul's on one side of the mountain, David's on the other side of the mountain, and he's about to get caught. And when he gets caught, he's going to get strung up. I mean, that's what Saul's coming to do. He wants to kill this guy. And so I'm going to read verses 28 and 29 and close up this first absolutely high production quality episode. But in verse 28 here, so Saul returned from pursuing after David and went against the Philistines. Therefore that place was called the Rock of Escape. And David went up from there and lived in the strongholds of Engedi. So what had happened? While Saul was there just about to get David, the Philistines came, those pesky buggers. They came and started attacking another part of the kingdom. And so Saul had to go deal with that. Like right at the 11th hour, the very last second, all of a sudden Saul has to go deal with this so that the Philistines don't start kind of routing and running amok and taking down cities and doing those things that, your enemies do. And so David is just about to be given into Saul's hand, this moment of despair, and then boom, God uses the Philistines to come and then divert Saul's attention. He has to retreat and go back, and then this place becomes called the Rock of Escape. And then David lived up in these strongholds of Engedi. And that's the final promise here, is that God keeps his promises. And sometimes he does it in a near miss and dramatic fashion, but God always keeps his promises. A lot of times he does it in a way we don't see coming. And when he does, we should remember that, whether it's writing it down or whether it's shooting a quick video or whether it's sharing your testimony to people, but it gets commemorated by actually giving a special name to this place. It's now the Rock of Escape, the rock of God's promise, providing David's escape. It was nothing about David's cunning, nothing about his sneakiness, although he was super smart and super sneaky like a ninja. It wasn't about his power, and it wasn't about his hand being strong in and of itself. It was strengthened through Jonathan's encouragement in the Lord and through his covenanting with him. So he had God, and then he had community, right? And then he lives in this place, Engedi. And that's what we can dwell in. That's what we can always rest in, is that we live in this stronghold of Engedi. Our God is a strong tower. And we see in Psalm 34:8, David writes, "O taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man or woman who takes refuge in him." So we are blessed in a full sense of peace and protection and safety. We're blessed when we take stronghold, or when we take solace in God as our stronghold, because we can trust his promises. And then when he comes through, let's not forget. I do this in my life so often, and I write it down in my Bible when things happen and put a date on it. And then when I come back through, whoa, I remember, oh my goodness, I can trust God. So that is the wrap up for today in 1 Samuel chapter 23. And what you're going to see with more of these videos is that it's just going to be some low budget Bible teaching. It's my favorite thing in the whole world to do, and I hope it's helpful and edifying to you as we cruise through these Bible Better episodes. But the whole point is to help us all understand the Bible better so that we can know Jesus, sit at his feet, and be changed and transformed so that we can go on his mission and then trust in his promises that he's gone before us.